Good evening, it's John Heaton, and I've had a request to review this album from Paul Simon, Hearts and Bones, from November the 4th, 1983. So this was the sixth solo album to come out from Paul after the split of Simon and Garfunkel in 1970. And I remember when it came out because three other albums from favourite artists of mine came out in the same week. Infidels from Bob Dylan, Pipes of Peace from Paul McCartney, and Undercover from the Stones. And I think it just goes to prove that commercial success doesn't necessarily mean, doesn't dictate how good an album is, because Pipes of Peace did probably the best out of those albums, getting to number one. This album only reached number 34 in the UK and 35 in the US. And out of those four albums I mentioned, this one and Infidels from Bob Dylan have lasted the best. Although I have to say, it's not a great cover, is it? It's a kind of early selfie. I don't know what he was thinking. The previous cover, One Trick Pony, was a much better cover. And previous albums, like his first solo album, There Goes Rhyming Simon, decent covers. But this one doesn't exactly inspire you, nor does the back cover. But more importantly, it's the music which matters. So this was the first album to come out after One Trick Pony, and also the first album from 1980, and the first album to come out after this reunion album recorded in September 1981 in New York City, and then after which Simon and Garfunkel went on I'm not sure how extensive it was, but it was a kind of a world tour. It did several gigs, but animosity crept in, and they didn't stay together for long. But on that tour, they did preview a few of these songs together, singing them together, and Garfunkel was involved in the early sessions for this album, because I think the original plan was to make this a Simon and Garfunkel album, but listening to the songs and reading the lyrics, I really would have been surprised if it had ended up being a Simon and Garfunkel album, because it is so personal, a lot of the material, and I don't know the details, but one way or another, Art Garfunkel left the proceedings and Paul Simon wiped out any vocals that may have been recorded and continued it as a solo album. So the musicians on this album are a bit of a mixture between the old crew, like Eric Gale and Steve Gadd. Eric Gale, had he played on the Central Park? No, he did. He played on One Trick Pony, I'm pretty sure, and Steve Gadd was on the Central Park gig. Richard T is on here on bass on quite a few tracks. He played on Central Park and on One Trick Pony as well. Anthony Jackson on bass was on the Central Park album as well. But then you've got some new names like Nile Rodgers on guitar, and I'll come to that in a minute, but the production on this album is again a mixture between the old style, kind of One Trick Pony style of the previous album, and a kind of attempt to be a little bit more 80s, and I think that doesn't really work, that latter bit on certain tracks on this album. Having said that, Russ Titelman is co-producing with Roy Haley, and the great producer who did a masterful job on the George Harrison album of 4 years previous. And for the most part, the production is okay. It's just occasionally it gets a bit annoying with a little bit too many synthesizers and this kind of modern guitar sound of Nile Rodgers. I don't think it really fits Paul's style too well. The reviews when it came out were kind of mixed. Commercially, it didn't do very well, as I said, but I pasted this review. I don't know, can't remember where it came from, maybe a Sunday paper or something, and this review is very positive. It even praises Cars Are Cars, one of my least favourite tracks, and the All Music Guide to Rock gave it 4 stars and said it's one of his most personal, one of his most ambitious, and one of his best works, and called it his best album in a decade. Well, I don't know about his most personal, because I find all of Paul Simon's first few solo albums to be extremely personal, almost painfully so, particularly Still Crazy after all these years. So I don't know if this is any more personal. I don't find it more personal, and his first solo album was certainly pretty harrowing, some of the lyrics there. I wouldn't say it's even a return to form, because I don't actually prefer this album to One Trick Pony, the previous one. I think they're more or less on a par. And if I had to pick my favourite Paul Simon albums, it would be the first three from the early 70s. And then after this one came Graceland, which had some great moments, great collaboration with Ladysmith Black Mambazo. And then slowly after that it went kind of downhill for the most part, with some highlights here and there in the latter years. But in 1983 he was still a force to be reckoned with, and we all bought his albums with huge anticipation. So let's move on to the tracks. Anything else to say? I've talked about the cover. Okay, so opens up with a track called Allergies, which is one of those infectious melodies, upbeat songs, a bit similar to Kodachrome in terms of setting the mood for the album, and puts you in a good frame of mind. Very infectious melody, starts off a bit slow, but then the drums kick in, and the lyrics are good and quite amusing. And then the title track, Hearts and Bones, is probably the best track on the album, or it's certainly up there in the top three, and in the same way that Graceland, the title track of the following album, was probably the best track on that album. Very heartwarming, moving lyrics about a relationship. I'm not sure, some people have said it's about him and Garfunkel, or maybe it's him and a partner or an ex-partner, I'm not sure, an old friend. Kind of one of those lyrics that could fit any number of scenarios, but it's beautifully sung, beautifully played, mostly an acoustic number with Anthony Jackson on bass, Steve Gale on drums, Richard T on piano, the normal crew doing a really tasteful job on backing. And then When Numbers Get Serious is another upbeat number, which was one of my favourites when the album first came out. Very amusing words. Doesn't mean not meaning too much. Bit of a dig at Japan in the lyrics here. I'm not sure if that was a dig at like the Japanese banking scene or something, but it's amusing to note that on McCartney's album of the same year, same month, on Pipes of Peace, he has a dig at the Japanese in the song The Pound is Sinking, when he says the yen is keeping up, which hardly seems surprising. So both of them having a bit of a dig. So poor Japanese, don't know what they did to deserve it, but anyway. This song is fun, and it's very well played, and it's upbeat. And then the next song, Think Too Much, appears twice. This is the first slower version, which doesn't actually work too well in my opinion. I think he probably could have left this version off the album, a bit like George Harrison should maybe have left off Isn't It a Pity, the second version of that song from his All Things Must Pass album. I don't know what the point in doing a song twice is, really. Certainly when the second version, or in this case the first version, doesn't really surpass the other one or add too much. Maybe you appreciate the lyrics a bit more on the slower version, I don't know, but it's okay. It's certainly not a highlight. And then side one closes with Song About the Moon, which is just for a really great tune. It's these kind of tunes were popping up on the previous album, like How the Heart Approaches What It Yearns, and That's Why God made the Movies. I don't know. And on this album, here and there, Paul's melodies effortless. I don't know. He seems as if he can write melodies in his sleep some of the time, and nice words. And this song was actually copyrighted in 1981, so it may well have been originally featuring Art Garfunkel on vocals, but which later were wiped. And this is a Paul Simon solo effort. By the way, there's a drummer on this album featuring on a few tracks, Jeff Porcaro, I'm not sure if I pronounced his name right, who also played the drums on the track Mother from Pink Floyd's The Wall, because Nick Mason allegedly couldn't master it. So that's an interesting little tidbit for you. And then we flip over the album to side 2. Lyrics here, by the way. It's on the Warner Brothers label, and nice moody picture of Paul there. And side 2 opens very strongly with a much better upbeat version of the song Think Too Much, with the memorable opening line. They say that the left side of the brain controls the right. They say that the right side has to work hard all night. Maybe I think too much for my own good. Some people say so, other people say no. The fact is, you don't think as much as you could. And you know, it's light, it's fun, it's well played, and on this occasion, Nile Rodgers' guitar suits the song, and it's a nice job all round, really. Musicians and singing and tune, and one in my top 3 songs on the album. And next we have a very moving ballad called Train in the Distance, and I remember Paul Simon appearing on the Terry Wogan show on the BBC around this time, and Wogan was enthusing about this track, and it is a very moving track about a broken relationship, and I think it's very, I don't know if it's autobiographical or not, but now the woman and the man remain in contact. Let us say it's for the child, with disagreements about the meaning of a marriage contract, conversations hard and wild, but from time to time he makes her laugh, she cooks a meal or two. Everybody loves the sound of a train in the distance. Everybody thinks it's true. So this is about, you know, the human tendency to always think that life is going to get better. The optimistic side of us all, should we say. So then what have we got next? Then we've got a song about Renee and Georgette Magritte with their dog after the war. This is the famous surrealist artist. I think it was French. 1898 to 1967. And he painted the famous green apple, which I think inspired McCartney to come up with the Apple name, actually, for the Apple label. You know, and lots of the picture of the bowler-hatted man and stuff, you know. And this song is a very moving song about them sort of, you know, walking around the place, hanging out in the park and stuff with their dog after the war. It's a top draw song, in my opinion. Very nice ballad indeed. And then we've got Cars Are Cars, which is probably one of the weaker tracks on the album. I don't think the production suits Paul Simon's style too much, and certainly this song is a bit too 80s for my liking. The lyrics are okay. It's about, you know, cars are cars all over the world, basically saying that you can rely on a car, you can't rely on human beings, kind of thing. It's inoffensive, but it's not much as a song. And then the album closes with the late great Johnny Ace, which had been premiered on this album, Concert in Central Park. It's a tribute to Johnny Ace, who was an R&B singer from the 50s who died in 54, accidental gunshot wound, age 25. And then the middle verse is about growing up in the 60s, and then the last verse is about John Lennon. So on a cold December evening, I was walking through the Christmas tide when the stranger came up and asked me if I'd heard John Lennon had died, and the two of us went to this bar and we stayed to close the place. And every song we played was for the late, great Johnny Ace. I don't know whether it was true, whether Paul did meet a stranger and go to a bar, but it's not a bad track. It's not the best Lennon tribute ever, but you know, it's not as good as McCartney's. But then Paul Simon wasn't as close to John as Paul McCartney. So anyway, not a bad end to the album, and you know, a heartfelt tribute, even if it's not that moving. So all in all, I'm going to give this album a solid 8 or 8.5 probably out of 10. I might give it more, but it's not quite as consistent as his top 70s work for me, but it's still an album worthy of investigation. Thanks for watching. Bye.